Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we're doing something a bit special. It's a focused deep dive, really tailored for those of you gearing up for the CSWIP 3.1 Welding Inspector Exam.
That's right. Or maybe you're just really keen on understanding what makes a weld truly sound and safe.
Exactly. Think of this as part of your CSWIP 3.1 exam prep series. We're aiming to sharpen your understanding, not just finding answers, but applying some critical thinking to core concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not just listing questions and answers. The idea is to really dissect why the right answers are right, understand the principles behind them,
And connect them to what happens out there in the real world of welding inspection.
Think of it as maybe a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed, getting those insights you need to really excel, not just pass an exam, but be good at the job.
Precisely. We've picked out a few questions that, they really get to the heart of welding principles. We'll lay out the scenario, look at the options, give the answer.
And then we'll dig in, explore that foundational knowledge, aiming for those aha moments that make things click.
Right. So if you're ready to dive deep into what it takes to be a top-tier welding inspector, let's get started.
Let's do it.
Okay, first scenario. Imagine you're on the shop floor, maybe watching a weld on some critical structure. Now, if the welding travel speed is doubled, but the current and voltage stay exactly the same, what happens to the heat input?
Right, okay.
Your options are A, reduced by 50%, B, increased by a factor of 2, C, about the same, or D, reduced by approximately 25%.
This is a fundamental one, and the physics points very clearly here. The correct answer is A, reduced by 50%.
Reduced by 50%. Okay. My first thought might be, faster speed, maybe spreads the heat thinner, but
yeah.
Is it always that exact, that 50%?
Well, theoretically, yes. The formula for heat input essentially is energy per unit length. It's calculated as voltage times amps times 60, divided by the travel speed, usually in millimeter per minute. So if voltage and amperage, that's your power, stay constant, and you double the speed in the denominator, mathematically, the result is halved.
Ah, right. So it's an inverse relationship.
Yeah.
Double the speed, half the heat input per millimeter or per inch of weld.
Exactly. You're applying the same amount of energy, but over twice the length in the same time. So each little bit of weld gets half the energy dose, if you like.
It's like painting a line faster with the same brush stroke. The paint layer gets thinner. Here, the paint is heat energy.
That's a good analogy. But you asked about the real world. And you're right to ask, can things affect it? Sure.
Like what?
Well, can the operator perfectly double the speed and maintain exactly the same arc length? Maybe not perfectly. There could be minor fluctuations.
Right, human factors.
Exactly. But the dominant effect, the main principle the exam is testing, is that doubling speed halves the heat input. And understanding this is, it's critical.
Why so critical?
Because heat input controls so much. Too much heat, you risk things like coarse grains in the HAZ, lower toughness, maybe more distortion. Too little heat, you could get lack of fusion, not enough penetration.
So it's a balance.
A really crucial balance. It directly impacts the weld's properties, its strength, its ability to handle stress. An inspector needs to know this relationship inside out.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
Okay.
So controlling speed is key to controlling heat. Now, speaking of high heat input, that leads us straight into the next question.
Okay.
Welds made with high heat inputs on carbon manganese steels, these often show a reduction in which property? Is it A, ductility, B, toughness, C, elongation, or D, penetration?
Another important one about material response. When you pump a lot of heat into CMN steels, the property that really suffers most significantly is B, toughness.
Toughness. Okay, we hear that word a lot. Is it different from hardness or strength? Why is losing toughness such a big deal?
Good question. They're related, but different. Toughness is about a material's ability to absorb energy and deform before it fractures. Think of it as resistance to brittle failure, especially under impact or at low temperatures.
Like being hit suddenly.
Exactly. High heat input means the metal stays hot longer and cools slower. This lets the grains in the steel microstructure, especially in the heat-affected zone, grow larger.
Bigger grains. That sounds bad.
It usually is for toughness. Think of fine grains as a tightly interlocking structure, good at stopping cracks. Coarse, large grains offer an easier path for a crack to run through. The material becomes more brittle.
So it might still be strong, maybe even hard, but it could snap more easily, like glass versus, say, a tough plastic.
That's a great way to think about it. It loses its ability to absorb that sudden shock energy. Imagine a bridge or a pressure vessel. You absolutely need toughness to prevent sudden, catastrophic brittle fracture, especially in the cold.
Right, a failure without warning.
Precisely. So reduced toughness in CMN steels due to high heat input is a major safety concern. Inspectors must verify heat input controls are followed to avoid creating this.
Understood. That really highlights the link between the welding procedure and the final safety of the structure. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Material types now. Not all steels behave the same way around magnets. Which of these steels is considered non-magnetic? Is it A, 18% R, 8% I, B, 2.25 CR, 10C, 9% R, 1MO, or D, 9% I?
Okay, material identification. This one tests knowledge of common alloy types. The non-magnetic one here is 18% R, 8% I.
18 to 8. That rings a bell. Isn't that like common stainless steel, like for sinks or cutlery?
Exactly. That composition, 18% chromium, 8% nickel, is typical for austenitic stainless steels like grade 304 or 316.
And why is that type non-magnetic when the others are?
It comes down to the atomic structure. Austenitic stainless steels have what's called a face-centered cubic, or FCC, crystal structure. At room temperature, this structure just doesn't support strong magnetic domains. It's inherently non-magnetic.
Ah, the crystal lattice itself.
Right. The other options, the low-alloy CR-MO steels and the 9% nickel steel, they generally have ferritic or martensitic structures, which are body-centered, cubic, or tetragonal, and those structures are ferromagnetic. They respond to magnets.
Okay, that's the why. But why does it matter for an inspector, apart from, identifying the material?
It matters quite a bit, actually. In some applications, magnetism itself is undesirable. Think sensitive electronics, medical devices, maybe scientific equipment where a magnetic field could cause interference.
Okay, functional reasons.
And critically for inspections, some NDT methods rely on magnetism. Magnetic particle inspection, MPI, is a prime example. You can't use MPI on non-magnetic austenitic stainless steel. It simply won't work.
Right, because you need the magnetic field lines to leak out at defects.
Exactly. So knowing if a material is magnetic or not is crucial for selecting the right NDT method and for ensuring the material is suitable for its intended service. It's fundamental material knowledge.
Got it. Another piece of the puzzle. Okay, let's move from material properties to potential problems, specifically hydrogen.
Hydrogen, always a concern.
Definitely. It can be a real headache. So thinking about hydrogen, which of these welding processes would produce the lowest levels in the finished weld, assuming you've got everything properly controlled? Is it A, MMA, B, SAW, C, TIG, or D, FCAW?
Right. Considering hydrogen control under ideal conditions, the process that inherently produces the lowest hydrogen levels is C, TIG welding, gas tungsten arc welding.
TIG. Okay, that makes intuitive sense and often seems like a cleaner process. But what specifically about TIG keeps the hydrogen down compared to, say, MMA or SAW?
The key difference is the absence of flux. In MMA, you have the electrode coating. In SAW, you have granular flux. In FCAW, you have flux inside the wire.
And flux can hold moisture.
Precisely. Moisture, HEOO, is the primary source of hydrogen in welding. Fluxes, especially if not stored correctly or baked properly, can absorb moisture from the air. When that moisture hits the arc, it breaks down and the hydrogen dissolves into the molten weld pool.
I see. And TIG doesn't use flux.
Correct. TIG uses a non-consumable tungsten electrode. If filler metal is used, it's a bare wire added separately. The shielding is provided by an inert gas like argon or helium flowing from the torch.
So if your shielding gas is dry, your filler wire is clean, and your base metal is clean,
then there are very few sources for hydrogen to get into the weld in the first place. It's inherently a low hydrogen process if good practices followed clean materials, pure gas.
And why is minimizing hydrogen so vital? We mentioned it's a headache, but what's the real danger?
The big danger is hydrogen-induced cracking, also called cold cracking or delayed cracking. Hydrogen is sneaky. It diffuses into the steel, especially the HAZ, and can cause tiny cracks to form, sometimes hours or days after welding.
Days later. That's scary.
It is, especially in high-strength steels or thick sections under restraint. It can lead to catastrophic failures that weren't apparent right after welding. So for critical applications, choosing a low hydrogen process like TIG and ensuring all controls are in place is absolutely paramount.
Really drives home the importance of process selection and meticulous control. Okay, one final question for this deep dive, focusing on a very practical challenge: distortion.
Yes, the bane of many welding projects.
Indeed. So which of these procedures would you expect to produce the least amount of distortion in, let's say, a 15 millimeter thick straight butt weld? Is it a TIG, single-sided multipass, B, MMA, single-sided multipass, C, MMA, double-sided multipass, or D, a SAW, one pass per side.
Okay, minimizing distortion in a reasonably thick butt weld. Considering these options, the procedure expected to produce the least distortion is D, SAW weld, one pass per side, submerged arc welding.
Interesting. That might seem counterintuitive to some. SAW puts a lot of heat with those big single passes, right? Wouldn't more heat mean more distortion?
That's a common thought, but distortion is mostly about unbalanced heating and cooling and the number of thermal cycles.
Unbalanced.
Think about single-sided welds, options A and B. You're putting all the heat and shrinkage stress on one side of the plate's neutral axis. That creates a strong bending force, causing significant angular distortion.
Like closing a book.
Exactly. Multi-pass welds also mean multiple heating and cooling cycles. Each pass adds more residual stress. Even the double-sided MMA, option C, while more balanced than single-sided, still involves many small passes and thermal cycles.
So why is SAW, one pass per side, better?
Because SAW, with its high deposition rate and deep penetration, can often complete the weld in just one pass from each side. While the total heat might be high, it's applied relatively quickly and, crucially, balanced across the thickness, one pass each side. This minimizes the number of thermal cycles dramatically.
Fewer cycles, less cumulative stress buildup.
Precisely, and the heat is distributed more uniformly through the thickness compared to many small localized passes. This leads to more balanced shrinkage and therefore less overall distortion, especially angular distortion in thicker sections.
So it's about the balance and minimizing those repeated stress cycles.
That's the key principle. S on the scenario offers the best combination for minimizing distortion in that 15mm butt weld. An inspector would look for good fit-up and consistent parameters to make sure that balance is maintained during the SAW process.
That really clarifies the mechanics behind distortion control.
Fantastic. Wow, okay. We have certainly covered some serious ground today.
We really have.
From heat input calculations and how they tie directly into toughness, to spotting non-magnetic steels by their composition, understanding hydrogen risks with different processes, and finally, strategies to minimize distortion.
These are all absolutely core concepts for the CSWIP 3.1 exam.
And I think just fundamental for being a really effective welding inspector day to day.
Absolutely. And I hope listeners picked up on the why. It's not just about memorizing answer A or C, understanding the principles behind it, the material science, the physics, the practical consequences. That's what builds real competence.
That's the foundation. Knowing why allows you to handle situations that aren't exactly like the textbook question.
Exactly. It lets you think critically on your feet. Couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something for you, our listeners, to maybe mull over. Beyond the factors we've talked about today, heat, material, process, geometry, what other, maybe more subtle variables could influence that final weld quality? Think about, say, environmental things like drafts, humidity, or even human factors. Operator fatigue near the end of a shift. Maybe a slight misunderstanding of the WPS.
The less quantifiable factors.
Exactly. How would a truly vigilant inspector account for those? Something to think about.
That's a great point to end on. Always more to consider.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this CS-SWIP-focused deep dive. Keep exploring these concepts, keep asking why, and keep building that expertise.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.